Okay, so yeah, so we have a new card. It is a new card for the Tale of Horus Travers. It's one of the legendaries, which means it'll be one of the like big campaign ender cards that we can pick up. It is a 4-cost 5/4 called Crimson Firemaw, and it does have flying, which means that it is almost entirely upside. There is a lot to like about this card. For double red influence, you get a 5/4 flyer that is equivalent, pretty close, I would say, to Impending Doom, which is already just like kind of a bananas card. Impending Doom has 1 more health, which is kind of meaningful, but most things don't deal 4 damage, the main exception being Mortar, which is a card that you're probably going to see a lot of in this particular setup, so something to consider. I'm really curious to see where Crimson Firemaw ends up fitting. It is a very powerful card at 4, which means that it is something that you get to play in Fire that's going to do like a lot of good things. We saw a lot of Groundbreaker previously in some like sort of mono red decks, but the triple fire influence was a little bit too deep for most of the hybrid color decks, and oftentimes it would get skipped. This gives red a much more interesting mid-range style, and it means that red is going to have some pretty cool stuff in the mid-range for the first time in a while, I think. I don't think there's been a serious amount of fire-based mid-range for too much time, beyond Praxis, of course, which has a lot of time-based mid-range, and then the fire is almost incidental to that. But Crimson Firemaw fits pretty well as a aggro, like sort of pushing things into tempo. It's just a little bit in between what fire is normally doing right now. And yeah, it seems very, very solidly costed. It also has an ability on it, and like just talking about it as a French vanilla 5/4 for 4, this card's clearly going to have some influence. The ability is meaningful. It isn't necessarily going to win every game, but a lot of times the stat line is going to be doing that anyways. So yeah, I think that Crimson Firemaw has got some really interesting things going on. So fire-based mid-range wise, Crimson Firemaw is reducing the cost of the top card of your deck by 4, which means that it heavily rewards you for playing cards that are above 4 in cost, which means it might be particularly good in a bunch of different decks. We can certainly see it in Praxis midrange, because making a Heart of the Vault cheap is a pretty good idea. Like, amongst other things, you can play Crimson Firemaw on turn 6, reduce the cost of Heart of the Vault by 4, then cast Heart of the Vault for 2, and reduce the cost top card on top of your deck by 2, while also doing all of the Heart of the Vault things. So in Praxis midrange, this might be kind of a nuts card, and could actually do a lot of good in like warp type decks as well. I'm interested to see the Praxis archetype setups, because that's probably where the midrange fits most. However, I'm not sure if that is the specific best place for it. It may not actually be all that useful on that curve, especially since that curve is occupied by Sandstorm Titan, and Sandstorm Titan is kind of a card that like really does match up well against Crimson Firemaw, and is a card that you really want to be playing a lot. So like, yeah, as far as like Firemaw goes, I think it's more interesting in other types of decks and other colors, which is pretty important, because we actually want to have all of those other colors have good mid-range representation. And the one that excites me the most, of course, is Skycrag mid-range. I think there's a lot of like cool Skycrag big beater flyers in red and blue. There's a lot of interesting stuff going on there with like Pearlescent Drake and like sort of like the weird Overwhelm stuff going on. But Skycrag also has access to Mortar, which is a 4-cost deal 4 damage, like huge torch, and Crimson Firemaw reduces that to 0, makes it a very, very good combat trick. I think in general, like that's something that you really, really want to be doing in Skycrag, and making a lot of your other decks cheaper is going to be a really, really big deal. Bormoth is noting that you can discount Decimate it to 6, which if you can get that off, that's pretty solid. It's yet another card in like the weird the deck I'm always trying to build, where you, oh man, I can't even remember the name of the card. It's Jotun, Warrior Jotun, something or other. This is gonna bother me. Geralt Iceheart, that's right. Where I'm trying to like play spell-less decks, but this is another card that actually like really does a lot of good stuff with that, and it definitely fits with Mullet and Nakova as well. Cyber Ninja points out, which yeah, that is definitely the kind of like big Skycrag stuff that you really want to be seeing. I think if Crimson Firemaw belongs anywhere, it's gonna be in Skycrag decks. Big Skycrag Flyers is gonna be probably a reasonable archetype off of Crimson Firemaw, but this card has some flexibility. It's gonna be played in a lot of different decks. Stonescar has some interesting choices. The main thing about it being that, of course, you have Impending Doom right alongside it, and making Impending Doom's cost 0 is kind of nice. It also makes Obliterate's cost less, which is something that Stonescar really likes to do, as well as Smuggler's Stash, which is a card that Stonescar really wants to be playing with. So, like, if you're playing sort of like Callus decks, or if you're playing the like Stonescar Mauler's deck, like, this is back in season now, just because the discount on it means that you aren't damaged as much by like some really expensive cards in the deck. And Stonescar's like top end is actually really interesting. Like, you've got Voprex at the top, you have some pretty cool 7-drops. There's some interesting stuff there that you can really play around with, and Crimson just sort of helps you get to that. Being a 4-drop that you can play down at a reasonable range means that you have like yet another value unit in the 4 slot, which is a place where Stonescar is kind of missing some. So I think the Crimson Firemaw probably belongs there pretty well as well, and could be something of an influencer on slower Stonescar decks, which are my favorite kind of Stonescar decks. I actually really like Stonescar Burn, the like Champion of Chaos deck that was very good. Stonescar Maulers was really like one of my pet decks for a very long time. And I think it's got a much better chance of being viable with Crimson Firemaw out on the set. Which leaves one other color, Rakano. Rakano is probably the place where this has the least impact, but it does have some interesting, like, I'm always interested in Rakano midrange, and as Rakano midrange goes, there's some interesting choices. Things like the Infernus generator in, like, mono red is also really interesting. Let's jump back, though, because, yeah, we'll talk about Rakano a little bit more. Deep Forge Plate, crazy card. If you get it cheap, then off a Crimson Firemaw, that's pretty nuts. Navani Warsinger, a 4-drop that's just always this close to good enough. Really solid stuff. You can give Crimson Firemaw cards like Warhelm and Hammer of Might, all of which are like really nasty. And if you're playing that with the Navani deck, then like I think that works out pretty well. Big dragons generally do pretty well with weapons on them, so you could do some pretty cool mid-range weapony beater type things, and that would be pretty good for you. It also like is reasonable to discount some 3-cost cards, so cards like Shogun's Scepter, which are pretty valuable there. Like, I think that playing in the 3 to 4 range with Rakano is a little bit more interesting now, and certainly Crimson Firemaw can do some cool things with that. Beyond that, there are some ways to build like some pretty interesting pet decks around it. Like, I'm definitely curious to see if people can come up with some more Johnny type influences for it. Crimson Firemaw reducing the cost of cards like Witching Hour, or the cost of warp cards in particular. Playing a Crimson Firemaw into like a cheaper Vault. What is the Vault called? The 5-cost Workshop Forge. Many different things. Like, you could do like some interesting fun things with discounting and card drawing, and like cards like Excavate, for example. I think there are ways to put stuff on top of your deck, especially in Carpet Shuffle, and well, just Carpet Shuffle. I'm done. Carpet Shuffle, it's good. But yeah, like basically just having a nice mid-range unit that holds down the fort while also setting these kind of interesting things up can be really fun for Johnnies. I think this deck card is not a super strong like build around me card, but I do think that because it is so powerful by itself, that if you're trying to get a particular effect out of it, it's going to really help you to do that because it's so good on just straight value. So yeah, card is really interesting. I don't have too much more to note about Crimson Firemaw right now. It is good with World Pyre Phoenix. It's good with like there's a lot of stuff that just becomes available now because of Crimson Firemaw. I think my favorite that just came to me is Caleb, which, man, Caleb is way more playable with the Crimson Firemaw deck. Not only because like big red units carrying weapons is scary, but also because just 4-cost Caleb is kind of disgusting in sort of a low-cost tokens deck. So yeah, you could do some interesting things with that. Yeah, so card passes a lot of good tests. It's very good just on straight value. It is really interesting as a build around me card. It's not like strictly build around me in the sense of like Caldera Cradle or anything like that, but that extra benefit does mean that you can build some interesting ideas, and it also will lead to some really great moments in the game. So like what your Crimson Firemaw hits will sometimes matter, and it'll matter in a really fascinating way. So I think that like overall that's cool text. But just straight up, like this card is really, like a really good French vanilla, as we call it, which is a card that is vanilla with just a single piece of text. Like as a vanilla, it's just fine. Like a 5/4 is just amazing with flying, and like I think that's really solid in the red. And then also just so much cool stuff going on with it. Yeah, this card's A+. This is really going to be kind of an exciting card to play the Tale of Horus Travers for, which I will remind you costs 25,000. People commented a lot. I did not remember exactly how much it costed last time. So 25,000 coins for that, and or 1,000 gems, which is pretty cheap. I think that's like around, oh goodness, I'm not sure. I think it's like $7, $5 to $7 to $10, something like that. Pretty easy to get, and if you're getting like a founder's pack or something, you'll have enough gems for that. Or you can just build up the coin and play it free to play and get those cards and have a good time. So yeah, it's pretty cool stuff. So yeah, that's it for like the little spoiler breakdown. It's pretty cool to see, and I was pretty excited to see it show up on Kiblers' stream. So yeah, pretty fun. All right, so that's it for the spoiler breakdown. Let's play some Eternal, have a little bit of fun.